Let me tell you a story. It begins long before castles dotted the hills, or kings wore golden crowns, before the red phone booths and foggy London streets before tea time and tall ships. Back then, the island we now call England was wild and wooded. It was home to tribes who painted their faces followed the stars and carved stories into stone. They didn't call it England. They didn't even speak English. Some say the winds carried whispers from the sea gods. Others say the forests held old magic. And maybe they did, because this place, it never stopped changing. I remember seeing a black and white documentary once, grainy and slow, showing ancient stones standing alone on a plain. Stonehenge, they called it. Nobody really knows why it was built, but it stands there still like a memory the land refuses to forget. This is the beginning, not of a country, but of a place. And like any good bedtime story, it starts not with a crown, but with a whisper. So close your eyes, and I'll tell you what came next. Romans, roads, and rebellions. The Romans came in 43 AD. I still remember seeing a museum exhibit once shields lined up in a neat row, red and gold, with that stern Roman eagle watching from every corner. You could almost hear the marching boots. But for the people already living in Britain, the Celts, the tribes with their painted faces and iron blades, the arrival of Rome wasn't history. It was invasion. The Romans, as they often did, brought everything with them. Roads paved in stone, straight and stubborn, bathhouses with warm pools and mosaics that glittered like stars, temples to foreign gods, and laws, always laws. They called it Britannia, and they wanted it to behave. At first, many local rulers tried to make peace. Trade brought new goods, wine olives, coins, stamped with emperors' faces. Some even wore Roman tunics, tried to speak Latin, tried to belong. But not everyone was willing to bend the knee. There was a woman, Boudica. You might have heard her name in school, though maybe just in passing. Fiery hair queen of the Iceni tribe, and fierce enough to make an emperor sweat. When the Romans humiliated her family, she didn't write a letter of complaint. She raised an army. They say she burned Roman towns to ash. London, or Londinium as it was then, was left smoldering behind her. For a moment it seemed like Rome might lose the island. But Rome always came back. Their discipline, their legions, their cruel efficiency. It overwhelmed her rebellion. Boudica vanished from the records after that. Some say she poisoned herself rather than be paraded through the streets in chains. And still the roads kept stretching, through hills and valleys, all leading to Rome, they said. I once drove on a country road in England, narrow, quiet, flanked by hedgerows, and someone told me it followed the line of an old Roman road. 2,000 years later, and the path was still there. Rome's grip on Britain lasted nearly 4 centuries. That's longer than the United States has even existed. And for much of that time, life under Roman rule was complicated. There were forts, yes, and baths and grain shipments and theaters, but also taxes. Lots of taxes, and Roman governors who came and went, more concerned with promotions than the people. In the north, the Romans eventually gave up trying to tame the wild tribes, so they built a wall. Hadrian's Wall. I've seen pictures, stone stretching across the landscape like a scar, a message to the Picts this far and no farther. Even with the wall, the empire was thinning, not just in Britain, but everywhere. Rome was stretched like a thread across too much world. In the 4th century, they started pulling troops from Britain to defend more important frontiers, and by 410 AD, they were gone. The empire's time on the island had ended. No farewell parade, no last salute, just silence and uncertainty. Because the Romans had brought infrastructure, yes, but also dependency. When they left, they didn't just take their soldiers, they took order. What was left behind was a mix of Romanized Britons and native tribes, all trying to make sense of the pieces. Some towns emptied, roads fell into disrepair. Without Roman legions to keep the peace, new invaders peered across the channel. But here's the strange part. Though the Romans left, they never really disappeared. Their roads shaped the map. Their words filtered into language. Their buildings crumbled, but their stones were reused. Churches, castles, even cottages, all bearing bits of Roman bone in their walls. Once on a tour of an old church, the guide pointed out a single red brick in the foundation, the only one like it, that she said is Roman. It was a whisper from the past, still holding. So Britain moved forward, alone again, but not the same. The island had been touched by empire, and as we'll see, it wouldn't be the last time. Now the stage was set for a new kind of chaos, one not imposed by distant emperors, but brought by waves of newcomers, each with their own dreams of calling this island home. But that is another story. And if you're still awake, I'll tell it to you next. The Saxons and the shaping of England. After the Romans left, Britain didn't fall silent. It just changed voices. Into that quiet stepped new people, the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes. Their names sound like echoes now, but they came with real ships, real swords, and a hunger for land. They weren't invaders in shining armor. No legions, no marching drums, just wave after wave of settlers and warriors, crossing the North Sea from what is now Germany and Denmark. I remember reading an old English poem in school, The Seafarer, full of cold winds, gray seas, and a longing for something beyond the horizon. That was their world, harsh, salt-bitten, but full of possibility. At first they came as mercenaries. Some local rulers, desperate after Rome's departure, invited these newcomers to help fight off rival tribes and raiders. But swords once hired are hard to sheathe. The Saxons stayed, and they didn't come alone. They brought their families, their gods, their language. They took land, carved out kingdoms, and pushed the native Britons west, into the hills of Wales and Cornwall, and even across the sea into Brittany, in modern-day France. England as a word comes from Angleland, the land of the Angles. It didn't happen overnight. But the language we're speaking now, its roots reach back to their speech, Old English they called it, strange and beautiful. A tongue built from sea winds and sword fights. The Saxons didn't have a single king. They had many warlords with names like Ethelred and Offa, who ruled over patchwork kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, each with its own ambitions, its own wars, and its own rough version of law. But among the chaos, something started to form. Monasteries rose, built of stone and prayer. The monks copied books by candlelight, preserving not just scriptures, but the old wisdom of the world, even Roman texts. They kept the memory of learning alive, one careful page at a time. One of them was the Venerable Bede. You might have heard the name. He never left his corner of Northumbria, but he wrote the first real history of England, back when it was barely even England. His words survived, while battles didn't. And then came Christianity. It arrived not as a wave, but a ripple. A pope in faraway Rome sent a monk named Augustine to convert the Saxon kings. In 597 AD, he landed in Kent, and slowly the old gods gave way. Woden and Thunor faded, replaced by saints and churches, bells and crosses. Faith, it turns out, was more persuasive than the sword. Still, this wasn't a quiet time. Kingdoms clashed constantly. Borders shifted with every battle. You could be born in one realm and die in another, all without ever leaving your village. But the Saxons laid foundations. Laws were written, coins were minted, markets grew. Towns began to take shape. Not the great stone cities of Rome, but wooden halls, thatched roofs, smoke rising through morning mist. And then, just as things began to settle, a new shadow appeared on the horizon. The Vikings. I still remember seeing a longship once, not a real one, but a replica docked by the river on a windy day. Its carved dragon head watched the water, like it remembered everything. These weren't just raiders. They were storytellers, traders, settlers. But first they came for gold. In 793 AD, they attacked Lindisfarne, a holy island off the northeast coast. The monks were slaughtered, the treasures taken, and something broke open in the English mind. If the Roman invasion was a conquest, and the Saxon migration a transformation, then the Viking raids were a storm. They came in waves, year after year, not just for plunder, but for land. They burned towns, fought kings, and in time settled across the northeast in what became known as the Danelaw Viking-ruled territory. But the Saxons didn't vanish. They fought back. One king in particular stood tall, Alfred of Wessex, Alfred the Great, as he came to be known. He wasn't the biggest or boldest, but he was smart. He understood that to fight the Vikings he needed more than swords. He needed schools, walls, unity. He reorganized his kingdom, built defenses, promoted learning, and perhaps most importantly, he believed in something bigger than just survival. He believed England could be one, not just a cluster of feuding realms, but a single land with shared law, shared faith, shared purpose. And even though Alfred didn't live to see that dream completed, his descendants carried it forward. By the early 900s, Saxon kings were reclaiming Viking lands. Kingdom by kingdom, they stitched England together. So here we are, centuries after the Romans. And finally, something new was forming. A name. A nation. Fragile, yes, but real. And if you walked the roads back then, Roman, Saxon, or Viking built, you would have felt it, the hum of something just beginning. But of course, history doesn't rest, because just as England started to feel whole, a man across the sea was watching, and his claim to the crown would change everything. But we'll get to him next, if your eyes are still open. 1066 and the Norman Storm. You probably remember the year, even if history was never your favorite subject. 1066 sticks in the mind like a splinter. It was the kind of year they put on classroom posters and quiz questions, a turning point, a line in the sand. But if you were living in England back then, it didn't feel like history. It felt like tension, like everything was holding its breath. King Edward, known later as Edward the Confessor, had no children. And when a king has no heir, everyone starts looking at the crown like it's up for grabs, because it was. When Edward died in January of that year, Harold Godwinson, the most powerful noble in England, was crowned king. And for a moment, there was hope. Harold was English strong respected, but across the sea in Normandy, a man named William had other ideas. William wasn't just any noble. He was the Duke of Normandy, a region in northern France, and a skilled, ruthless leader. He claimed that Edward had promised him the crown years earlier, and that Harold had sworn on sacred relics no less to support his claim. Whether that's entirely true or just political storytelling, well, we'll never really know. But William believed it, and more importantly, he was ready to fight for it. While Harold prepared to defend his kingdom, trouble came from the north too. A Viking king, Harald Hardrada of Norway, invaded Yorkshire in September. Harold Godwinson marched his army north, defeated the Vikings in a brutal battle at Stamford Bridge. then had to turn right back around and march south, because William had landed. On the 28th of September 1066, William and his Norman army came ashore near Hastings, not as raiders but as a full-blown invasion, armor gleaming, cavalry-trained banners flying, the kind of army built to win or die trying. The two forces met on October 14th, the Battle of Hastings. I remember seeing the Bayeux Tapestry in a history book once, that long embroidered scroll full of stitched horses and arrows and kings. It's not just art, it's a message. William had it made to tell his version of the story, and according to that story, Harold died with an arrow in his eye. Whether that's true or not, Harold fell. His army broke, and William, once just a duke from across the water, became William the Conqueror. England would never be the same. Norman rule didn't just mean a new king. It meant a new language, a new elite, and a whole new way of doing things. French-speaking nobles replaced Anglo-Saxon ones. Castles sprang up like mushrooms after rain. Not cozy homes, but stone fists to keep the English in line. Towering symbols of power. I've stood inside one, the Tower of London, and even empty it hums with authority. William ordered a survey of his new kingdom, a vast census of land, wealth, and people. The Domesday Book, they called it, like Doomsday, because once it was written, there was no arguing, no changing your answer. It was law. The English language bent under the pressure. Norman French became the language of courts and power. Old English didn't disappear, but it mixed, evolved, shifted. And from that mix, modern English slowly began to rise. You can hear it even now in our words for food and law. Beef and mutton come from French, while cow and sheep are Saxon. One was for the Lord's table, the other for the peasant's work. The Normans brought more than language. They brought feudalism, a rigid hierarchy of lords, vassals, and serfs. Land wasn't just property. It was obligation, loyalty, control. The king granted it to his barons, and they to their knights, and so on down the line. It wasn't freedom, but it was order. Still, the English didn't just vanish into obedience. There were uprisings smothered ruthlessly. Towns burned, lands confiscated. In the north, William laid waste to entire regions in what historians now call the harrying of the North. Thousands died. Farms were salted, villages emptied. The conquest wasn't clean. It wasn't glorious. It was hard, bloody, and slow. But in time, a new identity began to form. Not Saxon, not Norman, something in between. By the time William died in 1087, the English crown had been forever altered. It was now not just a symbol, but a weight, passed from one ambitious hand to the next, each trying to hold it tighter than the last. And beneath all that, under the castles, under the law books and Latin prayers, the English people kept living, plowing fields, telling stories, bearing witness. Because history isn't just made by kings and battles. It's whispered in kitchens and carved into old stones. And even as the Normans tried to tame the land, England was already learning how to outlast its rulers. But the next few centuries, well, they'd be anything but quiet. Castles, crusades, and commoners. After the dust of conquest began to settle, England started to take a new shape. Stone by stone, castles rose higher, not just on battlefields, but in the center of life. These weren't the crumbling ruins we visit today. Back then, they were alive. Flags fluttered above them, smoke curled from their chimneys, and the sound of hooves echoed in their courtyards. Castles were more than homes. They were the seat of power, and they were everywhere. The Normans had brought the blueprint, and England filled the map. Motta and Bailey forts, at first quick to build, easy to defend. Then came the stone giants, Windsor, Dover, Warwick, cold gray, unmovable. I remember touring one as a kid, walls thicker than your arm span, stairwells so narrow you had to turn sideways. They weren't built for comfort. They were built to last. But while the lords lived behind high walls, the people lived in timber huts and walked through muddy streets. Life was hard. Food was simple. Bread, ale, maybe a bit of meat, if the season had been kind. And yet, even in hardship, there was rhythm. The bell in the church tower marked time. Markets opened in the square. Children played with carved dolls and pebbles. People found ways to live, to laugh, to love, and they found faith. The church became the beating heart of every village and town, not just for Sunday prayers, but for everything: births, weddings, deaths. It offered comfort, rules, and sometimes fear. The priests spoke Latin. Most people didn't understand the words, but they believed in the power behind them. The stained glass, the incense, the stone altars. It was a different world inside those walls, a world where heaven felt close. But not all the power stayed in England. The Crusades began in 1095, when Pope Urban II called for Christian knights to take back the Holy Land. Thousands answered the call, including English nobles. Some went for faith, others for glory, many for land. They marched across Europe toward Jerusalem, a city most had only heard of in sermons. The journey was long, brutal, and soaked in blood. Some never returned, but those who did brought stories, exotic spices, silk, new ideas. The world was bigger than anyone had imagined. And while kings were chasing battles overseas, something was stirring at home: the people. By the 1100s and 1200s, towns were growing. Trade was booming. Markets buzzed with wool grain leather. A new class began to rise, not lords, not peasants, but merchants, craftsmen, townsfolk. People with skills, ambition, and something: new money. The economy was changing, slowly but surely. And the monarchy was changing too. In 1215, after a string of blunders and taxes and arrogant overreach, King John, yes, the same one who became a villain in the Robin Hood stories, was forced to sign the Magna Carta. It was a moment no one expected. Not a revolution, not a rebellion, but a quiet, powerful idea that the king was not above the law. The Magna Carta didn't give peasants the right to vote or own land, but it planted a seed. It gave nobles, and eventually common people, a tool, the idea that rulers could be held accountable, that even the highest crown sat below the law. I once read a copy of it translated into modern English. It's dry, full of clauses about fish weirs and widows' rights. But beneath the surface it hums with something bigger: fairness, limits, balance. And while kings would ignore it, time and time again, the people didn't forget. Meanwhile, in the countryside, life carried on. Fields were plowed by hand and oxen. Crops followed the seasons. Famine came and went like a shadow. When the harvest failed, bellies groaned. When it succeeded, songs were sung. The Black Death would not come for another 100 years. But already the land felt fragile. Too many mouths, not enough grain, too much power in too few hands. Still, in taverns and hearths, stories were told. About saints and soldiers, about dragons and kings, about Robin Hood who stole from the rich and gave to the poor, a folk hero born from the ache of inequality. I don't know if he ever existed, but I do know people needed him to. By the 13th century, the first parliaments were being called. Not the kind we have now, not elected, not open to all, but a gathering of lords, bishops, and barons who could say no to the king, at least on a good day. The balance of power was tilting inch by inch. And so England wasn't just a place of swords and saints anymore. It was a place of law, of trade, of rising voices. And even though the world still turned for the few at the top, the many at the bottom were no longer invisible. They were gathering, watching, waiting, and soon they'd have their moment. Plague, revolt, and the peasant's voice. You could smell death in the wind. It started, as these things often do, far away. Rumors from the east, a sickness riding the Silk Roads, a cough, a swelling, a death. But England was an island. People thought maybe the sea would protect them. It didn't. In 1348, the Black Death arrived. No one knew what it was not then. Today we call it the bubonic plague, caused by a bacterium, spread by fleas on rats. But to the people who lived it, it was something else entirely. A punishment, a curse, the end. It swept through villages like fire. One day you felt fine, the next fever, then the swellings, then silence. Parents buried children, children buried parents. Priests gave last rites in whispers, if they dared come at all. I remember reading that in some places, they had no one left to ring the church bells. The death toll was that complete. By the time it passed, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population was gone. And yet from the silence, something unexpected began to stir. The fields still needed tending. The houses still needed building. But there were fewer hands now, and fewer hands meant more power. For the first time, peasants could demand higher wages. If a lord refused, they could leave and work elsewhere. Labor wasn't just cheap anymore. It was rare. And the old order didn't like that. In 1351, Parliament passed the Statute of Laborers, a law that tried to freeze wages and bind people to their lords again. But you can't unring a bell. The world had shifted. Then came the taxes. War with France, the 100 Years' War, they'd later call it, was draining the treasury. The crown needed coin, and it looked to the poorest for help. A poll tax the same for everyone, rich or poor, fair on parchment, cruel in practice. In 1381, the people snapped. They didn't come with swords at first. They came with questions. Why should we pay for wars we didn't start? Why do they preach that all men are equal before God, but treat us like dirt? In Kent and Essex, thousands of peasants gathered, not with chaos, but with purpose. Led by Wat Tyler and inspired by radical priests like John Ball, who famously asked, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, they marched on London. It wasn't a riot, it was a message. They demanded the end of serfdom, fair rents, and the removal of corrupt officials. King Richard II, just a teenager, met with the rebels, promised reforms, and then, once the crowds dispersed, had their leaders hunted and killed. Wat Tyler was stabbed during a parley. Others were hanged. The revolt was crushed, but not forgotten. Because even though the demands were denied, the message had landed. The old system had cracks, and every time someone walked past the gallows, they remembered. Peasants weren't just tools anymore. They had voices, and though muffled, they would speak again. Meanwhile, up in the cathedrals and abbeys, a quieter change was brewing. English was returning. For centuries, French had been the language of the elite, Latin, the language of the church. But now in marketplaces and parishes, English was being written again, not just spoken, but recorded. In the late 1300s, a man named Geoffrey Chaucer wrote stories not in Latin or French, but in English. The Canterbury Tales, pilgrims and parsons, knights and millers telling tales on the road to a holy shrine. I tried reading them once in the original. Hard to follow, but rhythmic, earthy, real. It was the voice of the people, not just the scholars. Art was shifting too. Stained glass told stories not just of saints, but of local heroes. Music grew more complex. And in the corners of towns, literacy was creeping outward, to merchants, to craftsmen, even to women. It wasn't a golden age, not yet. But it was a dawn. England was still a feudal land, still ruled by kings and bishops. But the foundation had shifted. Power was no longer just blood and sword. It was voice and ink and coin. And even though plague would come again, and wars would rage on something, in the soul of the country had changed. It had seen death, and survived. Roses, thrones, and the making of a Tudor. You ever look at a family photo and realize, no one's smiling? That's what England looked like in the 1400s. A family feud, only this one came with armies. It started with two royal houses. The House of Lancaster wore the red rose, the House of York the white. Both traced their blood back to Edward III. Both thought they had the stronger claim to the throne, and neither was willing to back down. They called it the Wars of the Roses. But it wasn't poetic. It was brutal. It was cousin against cousin, lord against lord, sometimes even brother against brother. I remember watching a documentary once where the map of England lit up like a battlefield. Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury, each name another chapter in a fight that dragged on for decades. The throne changed hands like a coin in a crooked game. First Lancaster, then York, then back again. Kings were crowned, then dragged through the mud. Richard II was deposed. Henry VI lost his mind. Edward IV took over. Then came Richard III, hunchbacked, ruthless, controversial. They say he locked his nephews in the Tower of London, and they were never seen again. No one knows for sure. But suspicion clung to him like fog. And then, in 1485, everything changed. At a place called Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian, with a shaky claim, but a sharp mind, defeated Richard III and took the crown. The last Plantagenet king fell. The Tudors rose. Henry VII didn't win with brute force. He won with patience. He married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses. Red rose, white rose, one crown, one England. And just like that, a new dynasty began. Henry VII ruled with caution. After all that bloodshed, England needed stability. He tightened finances, strengthened the crown, avoided war. He wasn't flashy, more calculator than conqueror, but he laid the foundation for something bigger. Because his son was not cautious. His son was Henry VIII. Now, if you went to school in America, you probably know two things about Henry VIII. He had 6 wives, and he started his own church. Both are true. But behind the headlines, there was a deeper shift happening. Henry was charismatic, athletic, well-educated, the kind of king who loved music, poetry, and tournaments until he didn't get his way. He married Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, but when she failed to produce a male heir, he wanted an annulment. The Pope refused. So Henry broke from Rome. Just like that, England had its own church. The Church of England. At first, it didn't look too different. Same churches, same prayers. But now the king, not the Pope, was at the top. That was seismic. He dissolved monasteries, took their wealth, and handed the land to his loyal nobles. It was a land grab, but also a cultural earthquake. Centuries of religious tradition gone in a flash of royal decree. And then came the wives. 6 in total. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. That old rhyme still echoes in British classrooms. Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne, Catherine, Catherine. Each marriage had its own story. Anne Boleyn, fiery and ambitious, gave birth to Elizabeth, but couldn't give him a son. She lost her head. Jane Seymour gave him Edward, but died days later. The rest. Political, tragic, forgettable. Henry grew paranoid, bloated, bitter. By the end of his life, he was hardly the golden prince who had once danced in the halls of Hampton Court. But his legacy was cemented. He had changed England forever, not just its marriages, but its religion, its monarchy, its very soul. And waiting in the wings was a queen, Elizabeth. But before she could reign, England had to weather more storms. Henry's only son, Edward VI, ruled briefly. Just a boy, sickly, bookish, and gone too soon. Then came Mary, Henry's oldest daughter, born of Catherine of Aragon, a Catholic through and through. She tried to undo her father's reforms, burned Protestants at the stake. They called her Bloody Mary. And then in 1558, a red-haired woman took the throne, Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, unmarried, unapologetic, unstoppable. But that's a story for another night. The Virgin Queen and her island empire. She was born in scandal and crowned in doubt, but she reigned like a legend. Elizabeth III, the red-haired daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, a woman born into a kingdom unsure of its soul, Protestant or Catholic Tudor or traitor monarch or martyr. When she took the throne in 1558, the country held its breath, and she smiled. She was 25 years old, fluent in Latin and Greek, sharp as flint, and more cautious than she let on. Her childhood had taught her that favor could vanish overnight, and that queens who misstepped could lose more than power. They could lose their heads. So she ruled carefully, cleverly, and above all, independently. They called her the Virgin Queen, but that title was more political than personal. Elizabeth never married, not for lack of suitors. Kings, dukes, princes lined up like chess pieces. But she saw what marriage had done to other queens. She once said, "I will have but one mistress here and no master." Instead of a husband, she chose England, and it worked. Under Elizabeth, the country steadied. The Church of England was cemented, not too Catholic, not too radical, just Protestant enough to appease reformers, but traditional enough to soothe the old guard. She surrounded herself with loyal advisers: William Cecil, her watchful counselor; Francis Walsingham, her spy master, who unraveled plots like a spider with silk; and Robert Dudley, the rumored love she never married. Politics, after all, was her first love. But it wasn't all peace. Across the Channel, Spain was watching, and not fondly. Philip II, King of Spain, had once been married to Elizabeth's sister Mary. Now he watched as England grew bolder and more Protestant. He saw pirates, sorry privateers, like Francis Drake, raiding Spanish ships and bringing gold home to Elizabeth. And worst of all, he saw England supporting Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. So he sent a fleet, the Spanish Armada. It was 1588. Spain, the most powerful empire in the world, launched 130 ships to invade England and restore Catholic rule. And England had smaller ships, less firepower, and unpredictable weather. But it also had Elizabeth. She rode to Tilbury, in armor, standing before her troops, and declared she had the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England, too. Then the wind shifted. Storms battered the Armada. English fire ships scattered the formation. Cannon fire finished the job. It was a miracle. Or as the coins said, God blew, and they were scattered. England had survived. More than that, it had stood up to an empire, and won. The defeat of the Spanish Armada wasn't just a naval victory. It was a psychological one. It told the world this little island had teeth. Meanwhile, at home, something else was blooming. Art. This was the age of Shakespeare, of Marlowe, of Spencer. Theaters filled with words that danced. Histories, comedies, tragedies, stories for the masses and the court alike. The English language itself was evolving, stretching, growing poetic. In dusty rooms, explorers traced maps with trembling fingers. Walter Raleigh set sail for the New World. Virginia, named, of course, for the Virgin Queen, appeared on the maps. England was looking outward. But Elizabeth, for all her glory, ruled alone. And age came quietly. She never named an heir, but all eyes turned to Scotland, to James VI, son of her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary had been a thorn in Elizabeth's side for years, a Catholic queen with a blood claim to England's throne. Elizabeth had kept her under house arrest for nearly 2 decades. In 1587, after uncovering one too many plots, she signed the execution order. The axe fell, and the future became clearer. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the people wept, not just because a queen had died, but because an era had ended, the Elizabethan age. She had ruled for 45 years, left no children, and yet England was stronger than when she found it, more confident, more English, and so began the next chapter, a king from Scotland. A new dynasty, and new storms on the horizon. But that, my friend, is a tale for tomorrow night. The Stuart kings and Civil War things. When Elizabeth died in 1603, it felt like the end of something golden, but the kingdom still needed a crown. And the next in line, he spoke with a Scottish accent. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns of 2 nations under one monarch. For the first time, England and Scotland had the same king, though not quite the same government. That part would take another century to sort out. James was a thinker, a writer, and deeply convinced that kings ruled by divine right, meaning God put him there, and questioning him was like questioning heaven. That didn't sit well with Parliament. But James wasn't about to budge. He once said, "A subject makes a king, but a king is not bound to his subjects." Try putting that on a bumper sticker. Still, James gave us something lasting, the King James Bible, a sweeping translation that shaped English for centuries. Its phrasing still echoes in wedding vows, political speeches, and even pop lyrics. For all his flaws, James gave the English language a voice that sounded almost holy. Then came his son, Charles III. If James was stubborn, Charles was granite. He believed even more firmly in divine right, and even less in compromise. He married a Catholic queen, raised taxes without Parliament's consent, and dismissed the very body that was supposed to check his power. For 11 years, Charles ruled without calling Parliament. People called it the personal rule. Others called it tyranny. But trouble was brewing. Religion, always a tender wire, began to spark. England was officially Protestant, but Puritans, those who wanted an even purer church, felt Charles was sliding back toward Catholicism. His reforms, his advisors, even his wife, they all made people nervous. Then Charles tried to impose a new prayer book on Scotland. The Scots were not amused. They revolted. To raise money for war, Charles had to recall Parliament. And once they were back, they weren't leaving quietly. The tension exploded in 1642. Royalists, those loyal to the king, took up arms. Parliamentarians, those loyal to the House of Commons, did the same. What followed was a civil war that split the country, the court, and even families. There were no clean lines. Neighbors fought neighbors. Brothers took opposite sides. The fighting spread like fire across the kingdom. On one side, cavaliers, proud, dashing, noble. On the other, Roundheads, stern, practical, driven. Leading the parliamentarian forces was Oliver Cromwell, a man of faith and iron discipline. He wasn't born noble, but he fought like destiny had his back. By 1645, the tide had turned. Cromwell's new model army was too organized, too motivated. The king was captured, then escaped, then captured again. And in 1649, something happened that no one believed possible. They put the king on trial. A monarch appointed by God, remember, was found guilty of treason. Charles III walked to the scaffold in a thick fog, dressed in 2 shirts so he wouldn't shiver from cold and look afraid. He laid his head on the block, and England held its breath. The axe fell. For the first and only time in its history, England had executed its own king. The monarchy was abolished, the House of Lords dissolved, and in its place a republic, the Commonwealth of England. But it wasn't quite democracy. Cromwell became Lord Protector, a title that sounded humble, but masked real power. He ruled with strict Puritan values. Theaters closed, dancing banned, even Christmas celebrations frowned upon. Some called it godly, others called it grim. When Cromwell died in 1658, his son tried to carry on, but Richard Cromwell was no Oliver. The republic wobbled, the army grew restless, and the people missed the old ways. So in 1660, they brought the monarchy back, not with swords this time, but with open arms. Charles II, the son of the executed king, returned from exile. They called it the Restoration, and suddenly England smiled again. Theaters reopened, music played, laughter returned to the streets. Charles II was known as the Merry Monarch, and for good reason. He had charm-wit mistresses by the dozen and a talent for surviving politics. But he also had a past to reckon with. His father's ghost still haunted the palace. So did religion. Charles converted to Catholicism on his deathbed but kept it secret in life. His brother James II wasn't so discreet. James was openly Catholic, and when he took the throne in 1685, tensions soared. England had been down this road before. Another Catholic king, another chance at a religious war. So in 1688, Parliament acted. They invited William of Orange, a Protestant and husband, to James's daughter Mary to invade. And he did. With barely a shot fired, James fled. William and Mary were crowned. It was called the Glorious Revolution. No blood, no civil war, just a swap. But it wasn't just a change of monarchs. It was a shift in power. Parliament passed the Bill of Rights in 1689, a landmark document that limited the powers of the Crown, guaranteed certain freedoms, and established once and for all that the king ruled with Parliament, not above it. It was the beginning of constitutional monarchy. The king had a throne, but Parliament held the steering wheel. England was no longer just a kingdom. It was becoming a nation of laws, union, industry, and empire. By the dawn of the 1700s, England had been through fire, civil war, regicide, restoration, and revolution. But now, the kingdom looked north. Scotland. The two countries had shared a monarch since 1603, but they still had separate parliaments, laws, and currencies. It was a bit like being married, but living in separate houses. That changed in 1707. The Acts of Union were passed. England and Scotland became one, the Kingdom of Great Britain. It was not a romantic union. England wanted security, especially after Scotland flirted with France. Scotland needed economic stability after a failed colonial venture nearly bankrupted the country. The deal was struck. The flags were stitched together. A new chapter began. And as the 18th century unfolded, Britain, now a united kingdom, began to transform, not just politically, but physically. Towns grew louder. Rivers filled with barges. Smoke curled from chimneys. The Industrial Revolution had arrived. It did not happen overnight, but its hum grew louder by the year. Coal-powered steam engines, iron-forged rails and bridges. Cotton spun faster than hands could manage. The spinning jenny, the steam engine, the power loom inventions, stacked like dominoes, toppling old ways of life. Farms gave way to factories. Villages grew into cities. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds. They pulsed with new energy and with new problems. Child labor, filthy air, Disease in the slums, wealth stacked in the hands of a few while workers toiled for pennies and lived 6 to a room. But from the soot and struggle rose something else: power. Britain became the workshop of the world. It built ships, it built machines, it built dreams, and it looked outward. The empire expanded. India, the Caribbean, Africa, Canada, Australia. Trade routes spread like spiderwebs. Tea from China, spices from India, sugar from the West Indies, all flowing into London's ports and out to the world again. But the empire was not built with good intentions alone. It was built on conquest, on slavery, on the backs of millions who never asked to be ruled. The British East India Company, a private business with an army of its own, ruled vast swathes of India. Decisions were made in London. Lives were changed in Bengal. At home, the monarchy marched on. After Queen Anne, the last of the Stuarts, died in 1714 without an heir, the crown passed to a distant German cousin, George III. He barely spoke English, but he spoke power. The Hanoverian dynasty was born. Parliament by now had grown stronger. The modern office of Prime Minister began to emerge. Robert Walpole often called, "The first led not from a throne, but from the Commons." And then war. The 18th century was full of them. The War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars. Battles raged from Europe to the Americas. Soldiers died on muddy fields and tropical beaches alike. But the most painful wound it came from across the Atlantic, the American colonies. Once proud extensions of British rule, they grew restless. Taxes without representation, redcoats on every corner, a king who felt distant and deaf. In 1776, they declared independence. Britain fought and lost. It was a blow to pride, to power, to the image of empire. But the sun didn't set. The empire shifted focus to India, to Africa, to the Pacific. And at home, the 19th century dawned with a new monarch waiting in the wings, a young woman who would wear the crown for longer than anyone before her. Victoria. But that story, my friend, deserves its own evening. Queen Victoria and the Age of Steam. She was just 18 when the crown was placed on her head. Small in stature, but with a presence that would tower over the 19th century. Queen Victoria. Her reign began in 1837 and would last until 1901, 63 years that saw Britain change more than in any era before it. By the time she died, people no longer traveled by horse and carriage, but by train and telegraph. And Britain, it had become the largest empire the world had ever seen. But in the beginning, no one could have guessed that. Victoria was shy, sheltered. She had lived under the strict control of her mother and an advisor known as Sir John Conroy. They called it the Kensington system, and it kept her isolated from other children and even from her own father's family. But the moment she became queen, she stepped out from the shadows. "I will be good," she wrote in her diary. And she tried to be. Victoria valued duty, tradition, morality. She fell in love with her cousin Prince Albert, and together they became the ideal Victorian couple, proper, productive, endlessly photographed. Albert wasn't just a consort. He was a visionary. He believed in progress in science in the future. He helped organize the Great Exhibition of 1851, a kind of World's Fair, held in the dazzling Crystal Palace in Hyde Park. It was a celebration of industry, invention, and empire. The British proudly showed off their trains, their textiles, and their telegraphs. But behind the polished glass of the Crystal Palace was a more complicated story. The Industrial Revolution had turned Britain into a global power, but it had also turned cities into smoky labyrinths. Children still worked in mines. Women labored for hours in spinning rooms. Disease thrived in narrow alleys. Reformers fought for better housing, education, and labor laws. And while Britain preached morality at home, it ruled with might abroad. The empire stretched from Canada to Australia, from South Africa to Singapore. India, often called the jewel in the crown, was under direct British control after a bloody rebellion in 1857. The British Raj, as it came to be known, brought railroads, legal codes, and cricket to the subcontinent, but also exploitation, famine, and foreign rule. Victoria never set foot in India, but she was declared Empress of India in 1876. Back home, the age of steam transformed daily life. Trains connected cities in hours instead of days. Letters crossed the Atlantic in weeks instead of months. Telegraph lines buzzed with news from the corners of the globe. The world shrank, and Britain sat confidently at the center of it. But confidence bred contradictions. The Victorian era was famously proper, with strict codes of behavior and rigid class lines. Yet it was also the era of Jack the Ripper, of opium dens, of novels full of scandal and suppressed desire. It was an age of invention, photography, anesthesia, antiseptics, even early typewriters, but also of superstition, seances, and spiritualism. It was an age of faith, great church revivals, hymn writing, and Sunday schools, but also the age when Charles Darwin wrote On the Origin of Species and shook the very foundation of Christian belief with the theory of evolution. Victorians wanted order, but lived in chaos. And through it all, Queen Victoria endured. She had 9 children, wore black for decades after Prince Albert died in 1861, and ruled a country whose map grew pinker with each passing year, the color of British territory. But by the time the century turned, cracks were showing. Boer resistance in South Africa, Irish calls for home rule, Indian voices growing louder, and at home, a rising labor movement pushing for rights not just for nobles and merchants, but for miners, machinists, and milkmen. In 1901, Queen Victoria died. The end of her reign marked the end of an era, one draped in lace and soot, in iron and empire. The 20th century was knocking, and it would not be as polite. World at war, Britain, and the Great Conflict. It started with a gunshot. One man, one pistol, one dead archduke in a faraway place called Sarajevo. But what followed was the unraveling of the old world. It was 1914. Queen Victoria was gone, and her grandson, King George V, sat on the throne. He looked regal enough, but Europe was a family drama in uniform. The Kaiser of Germany was his cousin. So was the Tsar of Russia. 3 royal men playing chess with soldiers. The alliances had been drawn long before. Germany and Austria-Hungary on one side, Britain, France, and Russia on the other. When Austria declared war on Serbia, the dominoes began to fall, and when Germany invaded Belgium, Britain had no choice. The war to end all wars had begun. At first, people cheered. Boys lined up to enlist, thinking they'd be home by Christmas. Posters promised glory. Parades sent them off. They didn't know what awaited them. What awaited was mud, rats, shells that screamed from the sky, trenches that stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland. Stalemate. Millions of men dug in, dying by inches over fields named Ypres, the Somme, and Passchendaele. Gas crept along the ground. Machine guns mowed down charges like wheat. Horses became obsolete. Barbed wire and boots replaced the saber and steed. And still the war dragged on. Britain called upon its empire. Soldiers from India, Canada, Australia, and Africa came to fight in Europe's war. Their blood soaked foreign soil. Their names too often forgotten. At home, women filled the factories. They built munitions, drove ambulances, and kept the country running while the men fought. It changed everything. When the war finally ended, many wouldn't go back to just the house. The war changed language, shell shock, no man's land, over the top. It changed poetry. It changed medicine. It changed hope. In 1917, Russia dropped out. America came in. And by 1918, the Central Powers collapsed. The war ended with an armistice on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. But victory felt hollow. 9 million dead, 21 million wounded, whole towns of young men gone. The world counted its dead in silence and scars. And then came the flu. The Spanish flu of 1918 killed more than the war itself. It spread like smoke in a closed room. In England, as in the rest of the world, people died in the tens of thousands. Coffins ran short. The mourning never stopped. And the peace. The Treaty of Versailles tried to reshape Europe. Germany was punished harshly. But peace on paper doesn't heal bitterness. The seeds of the next war were planted in the ashes of this one. Back in Britain, things would never be quite the same. The old order of Lord's empire and endless optimism had cracked. Women had proven their strength. In 1918, some won the right to vote. Not all, but enough to mark a shift. Workers demanded rights. The Irish demanded freedom. And by 1922, Ireland would be split, with the Irish Free State gaining independence and Northern Ireland staying part of the United Kingdom. The empire was still vast, but its hold loosening. Jazz drifted in from America. Modernism challenged tradition. Cars hummed down cobblestone streets. The world was picking up speed, but for now, Britain was quiet. It had buried its sons. It had survived, but it was tired. And across the channel, another man was rising with anger in his voice and vengeance in his heart. The world was not done with war. Not yet. The Blitz, the beaches, and the British resolve. If you lived in London in 1940, you knew the sound before you saw the light. That rising whine in the sky, the distant hum of engines, and then the whistle falling shrieking, and the blast, the Blitz. For 57 consecutive nights, German bombers rained destruction over London. Not just military targets, but homes, schools, churches. Firestorms turned blocks to rubble. Glass shattered. Sirens wailed. And still people endured. Some slept in the underground stations packed shoulder to shoulder. Some stayed above stubborn, in the face of falling skies. And every morning, with dust in their hair and soot on their skin, they got up, cleaned up, and carried on. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, captured that spirit with words that echoed across time. We shall never surrender. But Britain had never been more alone. France had fallen. Much of Europe was under Nazi control, and Hitler had his eyes on the Channel. In 1940, the Battle of Britain was fought in the air. The Royal Air Force outnumbered, outgunned, flew mission after mission. They scrambled Spitfires and Hurricanes against the Luftwaffe. Young pilots, many barely 20, risked everything to keep the sky clear. They gave their today for our tomorrow, some said. Churchill put it simply. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. But the war wasn't just in the air. In 1941, German forces invaded the Soviet Union. Then in December, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered the war. Suddenly, Britain was no longer alone. Allies coordinated across oceans. American GIs arrived on British soil. Supply convoys braved U-boats to bring food and arms across the Atlantic. The war had become global again. In North Africa, British troops fought Rommel's tanks across deserts. In Italy, they pushed up boot-shaped hills. And in secret plans were drawn for something bigger. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Over 150,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy. British forces stormed sword and gold beaches. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. The sea ran red. The sand shook. but the beachheads held. From there, the Allies pushed inland. France was liberated, Belgium followed, and by 1945, the Reich was crumbling. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, crowds flooded Trafalgar Square. They sang, they hugged, they wept. The war in Europe was over, but it had left a scar. Over 450,000 Britons had died. Cities were flattened. Rations were still in place. And while Japan's surrender would come later that year, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the victory felt more somber than triumphant. Families were missing someone. The empire was exhausted. The world had changed. Churchill lost re-election in July 1945. The British people wanted rebuilding, not rhetoric. And so began a new chapter, not of conquest or war, but of care. The National Health Service would be born. Education would expand. A welfare state would rise. Britain had stood firm in the face of darkness. Now it had to figure out how to live in the light. Winds of change. The empire fades. The war was over, but victory came with a price. Britain, though, on the winning side, was broke. Entire cities needed rebuilding. Food was still rationed. And the empire was slipping through its fingers. In 1947, the sun set on one of its brightest jewels, India. After decades of struggle, protest, and negotiation, Britain agreed to grant independence. But it came at a cost. The country was divided, India and Pakistan, and the partition sparked violence, displacement, and death. Millions fled across new borders. Thousands were killed. It was a painful birth for two new nations and the end of Britain's rule in the subcontinent. But India was just the beginning. In the decades that followed, the British Empire unraveled, sometimes with negotiations, sometimes with gunfire. Burma, Sri Lanka, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Malaysia. Dozens of nations claimed their freedom one by one. Some waved goodbye politely. Others kicked the door down. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising led to bloody conflict. In Malaya, a communist insurgency challenged colonial rule. And in Cyprus, Ireland, and Palestine, violence and bombings forced Britain to face hard truths. The age of empire was ending. At home, Britain was changing too. A new world was being built from rubble. In 1948, the National Health Service was born, free health care for all from cradle to grave. It was revolutionary. It was personal. It was British. Housing was rebuilt. Schools expanded. Jobs grew. Immigrants from the Caribbean, India, and Africa were invited to help rebuild. They came aboard ships like the Empire Windrush, bringing music, food, language, and dreams. But not everyone welcomed them. Racism brewed in the streets. No blacks, no Irish, no dogs, read some signs. Britain struggled and still struggles with what it meant to be a post-imperial, multicultural nation. Meanwhile, the Cold War loomed. The world had split in two, the United States and the Soviet Union, capitalism and communism, and Britain caught in the middle, a fading power with nuclear weapons and a stiff upper lip. In 1956, Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt to seize control of the Suez Canal. It was bold, it was brash, and it was a disaster. The United States, yes, their ally, told them to back off. And they did. For many, it was the moment they realized Britain was no longer calling the shots. The empire wasn't just fading, it was over. Still, the royal family remained a symbol of continuity. In 1952, Princess Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth II, young, composed, dutiful. Her coronation was watched by millions on television, a new medium for a new era. Through the 1960s and 70s, Britain swung between pride and confusion. The Beatles sang of revolution. The Rolling Stones rattled the status quo. Fashion exploded on Carnaby Street. London was swinging, but strikes and blackouts dimmed the lights. Inflation soared, industry crumbled, and unemployment grew. The country seemed caught between past and future, unsure whether it was still great or just old. And yet through it all, Britain remained Britain. It drank its tea. It queued politely. It carried on. The empire was gone. But a new identity, smaller, more complex, more diverse, was beginning to take its place. Thatcher's Britain, iron and upheaval. She walked into number 10 in 1979 with a handbag, a sharp stare, and a mission. Margaret Thatcher, Britain's first female prime minister, the daughter of a grocer, a believer in hard work, small government, and tough choices. She didn't just want to lead Britain. She wanted to remake it. And she did. When she took office, the country was weary. The 1970s had been a blur of strikes, blackouts, and economic decline. Inflation was high. Unions were powerful. Factories were closing. The phrase "sick man of Europe" was whispered across boardrooms and pubs. Thatcher came to change all that. She slashed public spending. She sold off state-owned industries, gas, electricity, water, even British Telecom. She believed in the free market, in individuals, not institutions. There's no such thing as society, she once said. There are individual men and women, and there are families. To her supporters, she was bold, a necessary shock to a stagnant system. To her critics, she was ruthless, tearing apart communities in the name of profit. Nowhere was the clash more visible than in the coal fields. In 1984, the miners went on strike. It wasn't just about pay, it was about identity. Coal had built towns. It had powered Britain's rise. But Thatcher saw it as a burden. For a year, the country was locked in bitter conflict. Picket lines, police clashes, empty dinner tables. When the strike finally collapsed, so did the pits one by one. Whole towns never recovered. Yet the economy in some sectors did. Financial services boomed. London's skyline changed. The Big Bang deregulation of 1986 turned the city into a global finance hub. But the wealth wasn't evenly spread. The North and South felt like different countries. Thatcher also faced battles beyond the borders. In 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, a small British territory in the South Atlantic. Many had never heard of it before. But Thatcher acted fast. She sent ships, planes, troops. After 10 weeks of fighting, Britain reclaimed the islands. Over 900 lives were lost, but the victory boosted her popularity. "The lady's not for turning," she said, and voters believed her. But not all wars were fought with guns. In Northern Ireland, the Troubles raged on. Bombings, riots, assassinations. In 1984, the IRA tried to assassinate Thatcher herself, bombing her hotel in Brighton. She survived. 5 others did not. Through it all, she pushed forward. Privatize, deregulate, confront the unions. Ally closely with Ronald Reagan and the United States. Stand tall against the Soviet Union. She became the Iron Lady, admired, feared, and never ignored. But power, even iron power, has limits. By 1990, after over a decade in office, her own party turned on her. The poll tax, an unpopular flat-rate tax, had sparked protests. The economy was wobbling, and her leadership style, too rigid, some said, too autocratic. She resigned in tears. Her legacy, however, remained. Margaret Thatcher didn't just govern Britain. She transformed it. She broke consensus politics. She redefined the role of the state. She inspired, enraged, and reshaped the nation. Even today, mention her name in a room of Britons, and you'll feel the temperature shift. Some will raise a toast, others a fist. New Labour, New Britain, Hope, Cool Britannia, and Crisis. The year was 1997. The Spice Girls ruled the radio. The internet buzzed through dial-up modems. and a young charismatic man named Tony Blair walked into number 10 Downing Street with a promise. "New Labour, New Britain," he said. And for a moment, just a moment, the country believed him. After nearly 2 decades of conservative rule, Britain was ready for change. Thatcher had gone. Major had followed. The economy had stabilized, but inequality lingered. The nation was still figuring out who it wanted to be. Tony Blair offered an answer, a modern, youthful Britain, forward-looking, open, confident. He embraced the market economy, but promised compassion. He kept taxes low, but invested in schools and hospitals. He walked a fine line, not left, not right, but the third way. And for a while it worked. Class sizes shrank. Hospital waiting times fell. The minimum wage was introduced, and devolution gave more power to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. London even got its own mayor. Britain felt for the first time in a long time kind of cool. They called it Cool Britannia. The world noticed. Britpop boomed with bands like Oasis and Blur. Damien Hirst pickled sharks and sold them for millions. Kate Moss was everywhere, and London became a global capital of fashion, music, and art. But behind the pop culture sparkle, serious things were happening too. In 1998, after decades of violence, the Good Friday Agreement was signed in Northern Ireland. Catholics and Protestants, Republicans and Unionists agreed to share power, to end bloodshed, to hope. It was fragile. It was hard, but it held. Still, the world was changing fast. In 2001, the Twin Towers fell. Terrorism became the new global threat, and Tony Blair stood shoulder to shoulder with President George W. Bush. Together, they invaded Afghanistan. Later in 2003, they turned to Iraq, and that changed everything. The war was sold with claims of weapons of mass destruction, but none were found. British troops fought bravely, but the public grew uneasy. Protests erupted. Trust wavered. Tony Blair, once the golden boy of politics, saw his shine fade. By the time he left office in 2007, many admired what he'd built at home, but questioned what he had done abroad. His legacy, like Thatcher's, remains split. He was followed by Gordon Brown, a quieter, more serious man, a numbers guy, steady, reliable, and just in time for a storm. In 2008, the global financial crisis hit. Banks collapsed, markets panicked, pensions vanished. Britain, like much of the world, teetered on the edge. Brown acted fast. Bailouts, stimulus, emergency meetings. He may have helped avoid total collapse, but the damage was done. Recession, austerity, a new mood of uncertainty. And as the 2010 election approached, a different wind was blowing. People were tired of promises, of polished smiles, of politics as usual. Britain was about to enter a new chapter. Not as hopeful, not as unified, but undeniably real. Brexit, austerity, and the British divide. If you had told someone in 2010 that Britain would vote to leave the European Union, they might have laughed, or blinked, or said, "But why?" But by 2016, that question wasn't so easy to laugh at. Let's rewind. In 2010, the Labour government was out. The Conservative Party, led by David Cameron, formed a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. Britain was broke after the 2008 financial crisis, so Cameron and his Chancellor George Osborne introduced austerity. Cuts, lots of them. Welfare programs shrank. Local services disappeared. Public sector pay froze. The idea was to reduce the national debt, but for many, it felt like punishment for a crisis they didn't cause. Meanwhile, something else was brewing. Immigration was rising. The economy was shifting. Globalization had brought benefits, but mostly to the cities. In towns where factories had long shut down and pubs were turning into betting shops, frustration simmered. And then came the promise. To quiet the growing chorus of Eurosceptics in his party and among voters, David Cameron promised a referendum in or out of the European Union. He thought he'd win. He didn't. On June 23, 2016, Britain voted. 52% chose leave. It shocked the world. It shocked the country. The next morning, David Cameron resigned. Brexit wasn't just a political decision. It was a cultural one, a geographic one, a generational one. Young voters overwhelmingly chose to stay. Older voters, many who remembered life before the EU, voted to leave. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain. England and Wales mostly did not. And suddenly, the United Kingdom felt anything but united. Theresa May stepped in to deliver Brexit. It proved difficult. Negotiations dragged. Parliament bickered. Deadlines came and went. She called an election to strengthen her hand. It backfired. By 2019, exhausted and defeated, she too resigned. Enter Boris Johnson. Brash, blonde, full of slogans. Get Brexit done, he said. And with a new election and a clear majority, he did. Britain formally left the EU on January 31st, 2020. But done didn't mean over. New trade barriers, new rules, empty shelves, frustrated businesses, questions about Northern Ireland, and Scotland again talking about independence. The divide was deep, but something even deeper was about to hit. In March 2020, COVID-19 swept in. Lockdowns, face masks, clapping for healthcare workers, Zoom calls, empty streets, death tolls on the news. It was a test no government was fully prepared for. Britain rolled out vaccines quickly, but the early days were chaotic. Shortages, confusion, missteps. And Boris Johnson himself landed in intensive care, a reminder that no one, not even prime ministers, were immune. The pandemic exposed cracks that had been papered over for years. Inequality, underfunded hospitals, the fragile mental health of a tired nation. And when the clapping stopped, questions remained. What kind of country had Britain become? Austerity had drained resilience. Brexit had divided neighbors. And the pandemic had laid it all bare. Yet through it all, the muddle, the grief, the uncertainty, the British instinct to keep calm and carry on endured. But the tea tasted a little colder. The headlines felt a little sharper, and the answers were harder to find. The crown culture wars and a changing identity. She sat alone on a pew, wearing black, masked, silent. It was April 2021, the funeral of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and there in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Queen Elizabeth II mourned her husband of 73 years without family by her side due to pandemic restrictions. It was an image etched into British memory, not just for the grief, but for what it symbolized, an end of something, or maybe the beginning of something else. Because as the 2020s began, Britain was changing, fast. Let's start with the crown. For decades, Queen Elizabeth had been the quiet constant through wars, recessions, scandals, and cultural shifts. But behind palace walls, the institution she led was wobbling. Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties. Then, in a bombshell interview with Oprah Winfrey, they spoke of racism, mental health struggles, and the pressures of palace life. It shook the monarchy. Some defended the Queen. Others questioned the role of a royal family in a modern democracy. When Elizabeth passed away in 2022, the nation wept, but also paused. Charles III took the throne. But the crown no longer sat so easily. Polls showed growing Republican sentiment, especially among the young, and across the Commonwealth countries began quietly talking about becoming republics. And then there were the statues. In Bristol, a statue of slave trader Edward Colston was pulled down during a Black Lives Matter protest and dumped into the harbor. Across the country, towns re-examined street names, school titles, and imperial legacies. Some called it justice. Others called it erasure. A culture war had begun. Debates raged in Parliament on talk shows across dinner tables. Should Britain apologize for colonialism? Should schools teach unpatriotic history? Should museums return stolen artifacts? It wasn't just about the past. It was about who got to define the present. And identity wasn't just contested on the left. Brexit had already redrawn political lines. Traditional party loyalties frayed. Working-class voters in the north supported the Conservatives. Young professionals in cities leaned left. Scotland edged closer to independence. Northern Ireland eyed reunification with the South. Even within England, North and South spoke different languages, not literally, but economically, socially, emotionally. Add to that rising costs, a housing crisis, wages that hadn't grown in a decade. The NHS stretched to its limits, and the question echoed louder. What is Britain now? Not the Empire, not the plucky wartime island, not quite Europe, not quite America, a place in between. Still proud of Shakespeare and the BBC, but binging Netflix and borrowing slang from TikTok. Drinking tea, but also oat milk lattes. Singing hymns at school, but Googling astrology signs at night. The tension between tradition and change became the national soundtrack. And yet even in the confusion, something endured. Humor, self-deprecation, the weather obsession, a cueing instinct so powerful it could organize chaos at Glastonbury. Maybe that's what it meant to be British now, to ask the question out loud, shrug a little, and get on with it anyway. The Union Jack still flew. But beneath it, identities flickered and danced, complex, layered, restless. From pandemic to possibility, Britain's next chapter. The pandemic did something strange to time. Days blurred, weeks stretched, seasons slipped past. And when the fog lifted sometime in late 2022, maybe early 2023, Britain opened its eyes to a world that felt familiar, but tilted. Work had changed. Millions had swapped trains and ties for Zoom calls and slippers. The morning commute became a stroll to the kitchen table. Working from home was no longer a luxury. It was the default. But not for everyone. Delivery drivers, nurses, supermarket clerks. They had kept the country running often, at great cost. And now they wanted something back. Better pay, more respect, safer conditions. Strikes swept the country: rail workers, nurses, teachers. It felt like echoes of the 1970s, but with hashtags and high-vis vests. At the same time, the cost of living soared. Energy prices, grocery bills, rent. Everything climbed except wages. Families tightened budgets. Pubs shut early. Cafes raised prices or closed doors altogether. And yet, despite it all, there was a feeling in the air. Not quite optimism, but possibility. A sense that the chaos had cleared away the old furniture, and now there was room for something new. Young people in particular were leading the way. They were more diverse in background, belief, identity than any generation before. More connected, more vocal, more global. They cared about climate change, about mental health, about fairness, not just success. They marched, they organized, they voted, sometimes with ballots, sometimes with wallets, choosing brands and jobs that matched their values. Even the political map was shifting. Old parties fumbled to stay relevant. New voices emerged in local councils, on TikTok, through community organizing. Not always polished, not always professional, but often powerful. And tech, oh tech, continued its quiet revolution. Artificial intelligence, renewable energy, electric vehicles, robotics in hospitals, drones delivering groceries. Things that once sounded like science fiction were now just Tuesday. But not everyone was thrilled. With change came fear of being left behind, of losing control, of not recognizing the world outside your window. And that fear, it showed up in votes, in headlines, in conversations at corner shops. So where does that leave Britain? Somewhere in between? Not broken, not reborn, but rebuilding. There's no single story anymore, no stiff upper lip monologue, no imperial march. Instead, there's a collage, 1,000 stories overlapping. A Syrian refugee starting a bakery in Leeds, a retiree learning to code in Cornwall, a queer poet reading to school kids in Birmingham, a second-generation immigrant becoming the mayor of London, a nation wrestling with its past, but reaching slowly towards a future it hasn't yet defined. And maybe that's okay, because nations like people don't always need a tidy ending. Sometimes just moving forward is enough. And still it endures, a farewell to the island nation. There's something about islands. They shift in the tide, wear their edges down, but they never quite disappear. They remain battered, weathered, stubborn. So does Britain. We've walked through its centuries now, from misty hills and painted warriors to crowded factories and Brexit ballots. We've heard the footsteps of Romans, the chants of monks, the clash of swords, the clang of shipyards, and the quiet resolve of a nurse in a pandemic ward. We've seen the empire rise and fall, heard kings lose their heads and queens command entire eras, watched coal turn to steam to silicon, and through it all, the island endured. Not perfectly, not peacefully, but persistently. Because in the end, Britain is not just battles and borders. It's not just tea and titles. It's the sound of rain on old rooftops, the hiss of the kettle before dawn, the murmur of stories told in pubs and playgrounds, in palaces and council flats. It's people, messy, funny, frustrated, proud, still figuring out who they are, even after 2,000 years of history. And maybe that's the point. Not to have all the answers, not to be great, or fallen, or redeemed, but simply to be. To carry forward unsure, imperfect, but still moving. And if you're still awake now as the clock ticks past midnight and the story winds to a close, know this: the island is still there. And tomorrow, just like today, it will rise again, rain or shine, ready to tell another tale. Thanks for listening, and good night.